When you mention natural disasters, I think those are some of the most compelling stories that we cover. Because we focus so much on the human element in those types of stories, not just the, the politics of it and the logistics of it, but also the human part of it. I think that there's this unwritten rule for journalists that you should not get emotionally involved in a story, but it's very difficult not to get emotionally involved when you see this kind of suffering. And I have a trick when I know that, emotions get to me and I have to be on the air for one reason or another, and you feel compelled to cry, is, you throw your head back and you blink and the tears come back in, and you don't have to cry on the air. If it's taped, thank God you can just not use that part, because there are some people that, show their emotions on the air, and I think that that's not what the audience wants to see. The audience wants to see objectivity. Yes, they want to see the human side. Yes, they want to understand and feel that you are compassionate toward the people that you're interviewing and toward the situation. And you need to show that, but I just don't believe that we should become the protagonist. I didn't think about it. I didn't think so then, and I don't think so now. Throughout the 34 years that I have been working at this company, first on the local station and then on the network, I have always felt that people don't want to see my feelings, and that they should not have to see my feelings. That they should see, I should try to in a compassionate manner, show them the reality of what's going on. So I think that there's been several stories. Hurricane Mitch that you mentioned was one of them, because we saw a whole country being devastated, and thousands of people not just losing their homes, but losing their lives and losing their family members. In El Salvador, it was an earthquake that created a mudslide that I went to cover a story for Aquí y Ahora. Now, Aquí y Ahora is the news magazine that I do besides the newscast, and of course it's a lot more in-depth, so you have an opportunity to do longer stories. When you have that, you can spend a little more time. And there I was following a man who had lost his kids in this mudslide and was desperately trying to dig up the mud to find them. And I followed him for the first day and back to my hotel. I came back, he was still there. After 3 days, he was still there. And the first day, I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm digging up, trying to see if I can find my children's bodies." And the second day, he said, "I want to make sure that their bodies aren't mutilated and that they are complete before they come to pick them up." And they had these big cranes that were just taking off all the debris, cleaning up all the debris. But here you had just a few of the families who had very, very small things to dig up the dirt and try to find their loved ones. And the third day that we came by, the man was wearing the same clothes. And it was just devastating to see the look on his face, and the desperation. And he didn't look tired, he hadn't slept, he hadn't eaten, but he just needed to find something. He said, all I want now is to find a piece of my children. And we were there for hours, and I kept telling my photographer, we really have to leave. We have to put this story together. We have to leave tomorrow morning. It's an 8-minute story. And for those who know television, know that putting together an 8-minute story is not something you just whip up in a little while. It takes a little time. We had a lot of the material. And my cameraman, Angel Matos, who was standing there with his little light on top of his camera, he said, "We can't leave. This is the only light they have. They don't have any more light." The government that was doing the cleanup, search and rescue, at this time, it was only, they weren't trying to rescue anyone because they knew that there was no survivors. They were just kind of cleaning up and cleaning up the debris. They were long gone, the lights were out, and they were just using our lights to continue to dig. And you would hear someone in maybe a few feet away saying, "We found someone. It's a woman. She has long hair. She has a white shirt on." And they would all run. And the man that I was interviewing came back and said, "No, that wasn't my daughter. That was my neighbor's daughter." And he took her. And he kept digging. And then suddenly they said, "We found a body here." And he went and came back with carrying something in like a blanket. And I asked him, what happened? He said, "I found my daughter's foot." I said, how do you know it's your daughter's foot? He said, as parents, we know our kids' feet. And my youngest daughter was 1 at the time, and I remember telling her, you have the prettiest feet in the world. And I knew that if you put a lineup of feet of 1-year-olds, that I would recognize my daughter's foot. So I remember that we went back to work. We went back to the bureau in El Salvador. My cameraman, the soundman, when they still use soundmen, and my producer. And we didn't speak. We couldn't. We couldn't say anything. The only time, a word came out of my mouth is when I had to track my story. I sat down, I wrote it. They sat down, did what they had to do, and none of us could speak. When we left the next morning and came back, it was continued our work. That story aired that week. And 2 or 3 days later, I had to go to Washington to cover President Bush's inauguration. And the reason why I have to tell you this part of the story, it's funny. I was a columnist at the time, and I was writing a column about this. It was called Walking on Death, because since it was a mudslide and we were walking, of course we were walking on top of the houses and the trees, and you could see the antennas from the homes popping out from the top. Everything below us was death. So I was writing my column, and a friend of mine came over he brought Emilio Estefan so that I could interview him. He was attending one of the galas, and I was going to interview him as part of our coverage. And I did my interview, and we left, and about 2 or 3 years later, I ran into this friend again, and he said, in Bush's inauguration, did you really dislike Bush? And I said, why? He says, because you were so down and so depressed. And so it was, I couldn't believe how depressed and how down you were when you were there covering that inauguration. And I said, well, I told him the story of what had happened. It was something very hard to shake off, because it wasn't like you go and you do a story and it hurts you, but you know that you have to tell the story, and there's nothing you can do but tell the story and hope that someone will have compassion, and that maybe some international aid will come, and give some relief to these families that are being affected. That's the only thing you can do. But when you're there 1, 2, 3 days following the same story, it's very difficult for you to separate yourself from them. So for a long time, I think it affected me and my crew emotionally. And we knew that we would come back, just like many of these stories. You come back and you're coming to your home, to your family, to your air-conditioned house. And when they realized they lost their kids, they also realized they lost their home, and they lost everything. They lost everything. And we leave them and we continue with our lives. So that part of it, I think, whenever I cover, when it was El Salvador, that happened to me. When it was more recently the Haiti earthquake, where we saw so much death and destruction, it's the same feeling that you have when you go home. You go home and you're going to hug your daughter, and you're going to continue your life. And they're not, because some of them lost their children, some of them lost their parents or siblings, or some member of their family. And so it's hard to deal with that emotionally. But it's just a story for you. So how do you do it?
Do you think that your profession takes care of the people who are working in situations such as yourself, for the psychological toll that it takes just doing your job?
Well, not the industry itself. I think that's just something that the type of character that you have to develop. You have to develop very, very thick skin. So this business isn't for everyone. If you can't handle that, then it's not for you. Sometimes people will say, well, we're going to cover a story, or we're going on a trip or whatever, but it's adverse conditions. And I always tell them, I've been to Baghdad, I've been to Haiti, I can handle anything. So, you can handle anything logistically, and you can handle anything emotionally, because what could be worse than that? What could be worse than being under the conditions that we were in Baghdad, for example, when I was there 3 weeks after the war had started, and, you still had a lot of shooting going on, a lot of death going on, and going to places like Haiti and like El Salvador and like Honduras after Hurricane Mitch, and so many others that you've covered, that really prepares you to face almost any adverse situation.